Welcome to the Green Urbanist Podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining. This is our 50th episode. This podcast has been going for 2 years, basically exactly 2 years, and 50 episodes. Who would have thought it? Thanks to everyone who's been listening and enjoying this and sending messages and getting in contact with me. It's really, really nice. I feel like there's a kind of a nice community that's built up around it. Not to mention all the fantastic guests that I have gotten to know through doing this. Been looking at my stats for the podcast. What I find really interesting is the geographical spread. And of course, most of people listening are in Europe and North America, but there is actually listeners on every continent except for North and South Pole. But there's a couple hundred people who have listened in Africa, South America, and a few more in Asia and Oceania. So it's fantastic. Really, really happy to have gotten to this point, and I don't think there's any slowing down. We're gonna keep going. So, my first guest on the podcast 2 years ago was Giulia Mori, and I thought it would be a nice kind of complete circle to have you back on the podcast. So, welcome, Giulia. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Ross. Hello, everyone. It's great to be back. And if I can say, I would have thought that you would have continued from that first few episodes back in July 2020. So well done you.
Thank you very much. For people, well, I suppose in the last 2 years, a lot has changed. So maybe introduce yourself again. I'm sure a lot of people listening haven't heard the original episode. Although that's really good. That was about well-being in the built environment and in buildings. So if that's something you're interested in, it was episode number 3, I think. So scroll back through your podcast app and you'll find it. But please, introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you're doing.
Sounds good. So I have an architectural background as well as an engineering background. I trained back in Italy and then moved in the UK, where I completed my studies in environmental engineering. And then I started from there working in the built environment industry as a sustainability consultant. And this was back in 2015, 2016. So the industry has evolved a lot in the last 7 years, which is really quite exciting. And it's great to be part of this, the movement, the sustainability movement. So in my background within sustainability, I mostly work on buildings, more than at the planning level, which I know is your strength. And then in the last few years of my career, I really started focusing on well-being, so human-centric design and how it is that we can support the sustainability movement and at the same time making sure that people are happy and healthy in the buildings that they use. Because before the pandemic, when you were using buildings and staying indoors for at least 90% of our time, with the pandemic, that's probably closer to 100%. So we have to be really, really careful when it comes to designing and operating places that people use. So if you want to hear a bit more about all of that, as Ross said, we talked about it in episode 3 back in July 2020.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I think it's important to say, isn't it, that it's well-being and sustainability together. And it's really interesting that those two threads have sort of seem to have evolved together in the industry.
Yes, they do have a lot of synergies. For example, when we talk about thermocomfort, which I'm sure you want to expand more later in terms of the heat wave that Europe passed through in the last couple of weeks. Obviously, thermocomfort is something that affects our energy bills as well as our physical stress levels. So it's good to have design synergies to make sure that our people are happy as well as the building that they use are happy. And they do have some trade-off sometimes. But at the same time, we have to be quite balanced in the approach that we take to make sure that, again, health is prioritized, but at the same time, we don't break the bank when it comes to energy bills. For example, when we're talking about ventilation rates in commercial offices, for instance.
Yeah, because you might just, if you take kind of a tunnel vision approach to one or the other, you know, like I think the sort of an older sort of view of sustainability people and sort of the sort of tree hugging hippies that we used to be thought of as, I think, was very much of people like never turning their heating on and living in cold houses and just wearing like 3 jumpers all the time. I think that's a sort of when you go too far in the fully sustainability, keeping, you know, energy low direction. And equally, if you go too far in the well-being, you might give people lots of gadgets and technology to help them try and be as comfortable as possible. But of course, we know that's not very sustainable either. So
yes, at this point in time, it is 2022. We have the knowledge and the technology to really make sure that our buildings are as efficient as possible, with and without building services operating, so with and without air conditioning. Using as little heat as possible, but we also know that we don't need to live in sterile environments. That is something that really is needed in, for example, hospitals or clinical environment, not in our offices. So we have to be quite careful about how we treat the two and make sure that we use our knowledge at the best, and, you know, well-being and sustainability hold in their hands in the holistic approach of sustainability.
Lovely. Sounds good. Well, what we want to talk about on this episode was, for the last 2 years, I've been asking guests as a final question. I always ask guests the same question, unless I forget or we run out of time, which happens, that there's this idea that we're in a critical decade, that, you know, 2020 to 2030 is this very, very important decade in terms of taking action on climate change. And, you know, I always ask guests, what do you, from your perspective, what do you think needs to happen to ensure we're successful in that? It's really interesting to listen back over older episodes. And for people who maybe haven't heard this question or, haven't realized that I ask everyone this, it's always the final question. And I know often people don't make it to the end of podcast episodes, especially if they're an hour long. You know, sometimes you listen to 20 minutes and then you get distracted and then you don't come back to it. But probably that's like the best bit of the podcast, is like the last 10 minutes where I ask this question, because it's really interesting to see what people say. And I've had all sorts of responses. Some people take a really like broad view, and I've had people say we need to change our whole economic system. I've had other people who have taken, you know, who have interpreted the question in a more personal way and have said, like, you know, we just have to start working together and asking the right questions and have a spirit of collaboration with the way we work, the way we design buildings and that kind of thing. So everyone is right in a sense, because we all have to do a lot, and we all have to do everything that's within our power. I might insert a few clips of people saying their responses now.
I'd like to see the purpose of our economy shift from endless growth to the maximization of planetary health.
Less talk of how late we are, how we can't do anything anymore, that everything's an emergency and that it's a crisis, and much more talk about all of the beautiful things that have already happened, how much more that we can do.
A societal wide commitment, I guess, to being transformatist.
So what I will say is that decade is for too long for me. I'm a climate optimist. So what I would say is that in the next 3 to 5 years, what we would really like to see is that each country, each city has a net zero action plan, and really working towards it from a technical perspective, from an innovation perspective, from an urban design perspective.
But Giulia, when you came on the podcast, I hadn't thought of that question yet. So I didn't ask you when you were on.
I know. I remember that.
Yeah. So the world doesn't know what your opinion is on this, which is a big problem that we're going to solve right now. I'm going to ask you the question, and then we're going to have a chat, and I'm actually going to get the chance to answer the question as well after 50 episodes, which I never have before, of what my feeling is on this as well. So Giulia. Oh, I guess the other thing to say as well is when I started asking this, it was the beginning of the decade. Whereas now we're 2 years in. there's a lot there's less than a decade left to 2030, and so I'm sort of starting to reword it as by the end of the decade. So by the time we hit 2030, what do you think will need to have happened or changed?
I love the fact that you rephrased it in the last 2 years, because I can be quite precise, and the clock is ticking. So we're only 7 years and a bit less than a half away from 2030. So there is a lot that needs to happen. But before I talk about a few ideas that I had in mind, I would like to share with you my idea of success. So what does success look like if we were to hit, a good action on climate change, a positive action on climate change? I think for me, it would be to see actually the change happening. So there is a lot of talk.
There is.
But not a lot of walk at the moment. So there are a lot of ideas out there. And as I said earlier, we do have a lot of technology.
Yeah.
It's now about implementing all of this idea, deploying all of the technology, and really make the change happen. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Some of the things that we have been talking about in the last 7-10 years were actually talked about in the 70s. So some of the things, again, we haven't really invented it as millennials, if you want. We are very grateful to all the people that started the movement back in the days.
Decades ago, yeah.
Exactly. But now it's our chance, and it is our duty to change it. Something that I've heard recently about the millennial generation and the Gen Z generation is that for the first time, we are generations that will take action. We will not expect someone else to solve it for us, which is refreshing. It's good to see that we have that power, but it's also a lot to take in.
Yeah.
It's a lot of responsibility.
It's a lot of weight.
But at the same time, we'll talk about it towards the end, but I've recently been to a future leadership course with the UK Green Building Council, and through that course, with the amazing people around me, it really made me feel that I wasn't alone into all of this, that there are a lot of individuals out there that, again, have the knowledge, have the skills, have the passion to make this happen.
Yeah.
So let's make this happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to say as well that the whole sustainability community are just lovely people in general. Yes. Like everyone that I've met that is working on some aspect of sustainability is very friendly, very open, very willing to collaborate and everything. So I think, for people listening, I know a lot of students listen and people are early in their career. And if you're thinking that you want to be doing something involved, directly involved with sustainability, there's a lot of avenues, I think, now to get into it. But a lot of it is about finding your community.
Yes.
And your local community, and just finding people who are on the same page as you with it. Because otherwise, if you're in, and we all have friends and family and coworkers who don't think about these things, and that's fine. It's you can play a role in maybe helping them think about it. But I think finding people who are as passionate and as motivated as you will start to, it's a multiplier effect. It starts to get everyone doing more and more. So find your people if you can. I don't know, however you can.
Find people that inspire you.
Yeah.
Being a better person when it comes to sustainability.
Beautiful.
Good. So having said what success looks like, so making the change happen, I think there are a few points that I wanted to go through on how, what we could think about in the next 7.5 years to take action on climate change. So the first one is trigger behavioral change through policies. So we're often told when it comes to climate change that it's up to us as individuals to change the way that we live our lives, and that we have to make difficult decisions. We have to go hunt down the organically grown food in the shop that is 10 kilometers away, but you have to cycle there in the rain. So it's up to us. The burden is on us. And this is nor fair, nor the only solution. It's not silver bullet. So there is other ways that this should be tackled in. The action should be taken at a higher level through policies that can help industries, whole industries, change the way that they, for example, manufacture or the way that we move within a country. What about all the planes that we take and the fact that they're so cheap? Is that a true reflection of it? How do we change behavior? I think it's a big aspect of how we can have then success in an action to climate change, to mitigate climate change.
Yeah, I had a conversation recently with through my work with a couple of sort of big players in the industry in the southeast, and something they were saying about net zero in particular is they said, you know, look, the bulk of developers aren't going to change to properly sustainable development until it's legislated for, and it's because they operate in a competitive environment. So if they start doing something that is, from their perspective, is making them less competitive in the sense that they can deliver something less cheaply, then they just won't do it because it's not in their business model. Now we can talk about maybe that's a bit of a fallacy because actually, you know, now there's a green premium on things, so sustainable products and developments, you know, now attract, you know, people more. They're a selling point and that kind of thing. But I think it does ring true that actually for every amazing architect there's 10, you know, people in the industry who are just in it for profit, you know, frankly speaking. And that's, you know, we live in a capitalist society. That's to be expected, you know. So yeah, legislation is absolutely essential. And I think something that has come out just in the last week or so is an organization called Client Earth took the UK government to court, as they periodically do. That's their sort of reason to exist, is to take people to court who are not doing enough on climate change. They took the UK government to court over their net zero strategy, and it was ruled by the court that the strategy is actually unlawful because it has so little detail in it. And so they haven't done enough to pave the way towards achieving net zero by 2050, which is what is signed into law. And so then now they're going to have to, you know, the legal system is forcing them to put more detail on that and show how it's really going to happen. So more evidence, I think, of that.
Yes, I think this was a great example of how, you know, the legal system works and how it can protect action on climate change. So I really hope that we would see more of this. So more policies coming through, hopefully not through a court hearing.
Yes, yeah.
But through political systems, you know, trusting scientists, trusting engineers, trusting all people that have that technical knowledge on how climate change is taking its toll on us already, and really not leaving it to us as individuals, because we can be as good as we can be, but and then this brings me to my next topic. If we still have a choice that is less challenging, we would probably take that more easily.
Yeah.
And that brings me again to the choice factor. So, Ross, you talked about the green premium, but as long as there is a non-sustainable option that we can go for, it will still be the easiest one that most people will choose for a number of reasons. So, challenge, like we don't like to be challenged, we like to work business as usual, not just in the built environment, in anything that we do.
Yeah.
Why should I change the brand of cereals that I buy? I know where they are in the supermarket. I know how they taste. It's fine. Why do I have to change them? It is as simple as that. But there is also, as you mentioned, an issue on the cost of sustainable branded options. So because sustainable materials, and that could be in the construction industry, it could be when we're talking about food, when we're talking about fashion, in any realm that you can think of, they're often a bit more expensive, but that is a way to show that, for example, there was no modern slavery in the process that particular thing was produced, that the materials were fair trade, so that we're not exploiting somebody else's land for no money and leaving them without resources. So there is all this like protection of the supply chain and the people within the supply chain that often shows the true cost of what it takes to have that bowl of cereals in your table in the morning.
I love that you brought that up, because we forget that this sort of standard stuff that we're used to having, such as whether it's consumer products or the way our built environment operates with, you know, concrete and steel and everything very intensive, that is it's only cheap because someone else is getting exploited, and we don't see it. It's sort of hidden from us as consumers. And so it's not really a fair comparison, as you say, to say, oh, well, I'm sick of the sustainable option being more expensive. And it's like, no, that's how much it costs. The other thing is only cheaper because they've cut corners and frankly done some things that could be considered quite evil to get there.
Well, they ruin the environment. They ruin a lot of people's life, possibly. So it really not having the choice in the best sense possible. So having only sustainable choices, this is what I mean. Only having sustainable choices really is the way to get to that change that I meant earlier. When we still have these choices where something is cheaper but it's been produced in a less sustainable way, we still feel a bit less guilty of buying that. And just as an example of someone that has done that, Interface, which are a carpet manufacturer, actually quite pioneering in the sustainability realm. They started thinking about sustainability back in the 70s, and they developed their first sustainable carpet tile. So they had a few ranges within their full offering, and they saw that it wasn't that popular with their customers. So they decided that all their ranges were going to be sustainable going forward. So it's obviously a change that took place in a few years. It didn't happen overnight, as anything. Nothing happens overnight. Rome was not built in a day. So they slowly made sure that all their ranges are sustainable, so that their customers know that they're going for them for a specific product, and they know that it's always sustainable. Yeah,
that's a really good. Do you know what they do actually to make it more? I have no idea how a carpet is made. I'm going to be honest. What do they do to make it sustainable?
So it's a lot of components. It's about, for example, recycling materials from old carpet tiles into newer carpet tiles, ensuring, again, and this is my health and well-being hat on, ensuring that there is no toxicants in the material, because a material that is toxic can't be recycled as easily. Think as asbestos, as the prime example of that. And these are just a few examples of things that they do, but obviously they also have, I believe, very low carbon production standards in their own factories.
Yeah.
Going back to the choice, just to close this little paragraph of our discussion, sustainable branded products, when we're trusting them, when we're trusting the label, and it's not about greenwashing, really show us the real cost of manufacturing.
Yeah.
And this is where we should be moving into. So be a bit more aware as consumers on how much does it cost in terms of life and labor and cost of materials to prepare something that we take for granted sometimes.
Yeah.
But that also could be a bit cheaper in the way that we get rid of it. So maybe it lasts longer, or it's easier to bring it back to the waste loop, to the recycling loop, etc. So it might cost a bit more when you buy it, but then in the long term, the cost on the environment, the cost on the society might be much, much lower than the one that we have now.
Yeah, and I think something to consider as well is the way that industries and products are subsidized by governments. And I mean, the government in the UK has just basically, in a very backhanded way, there's the cost of living crisis at the moment where energy bills are really high and people are really struggling. What the government has done finally after a lot of pressure was they made a windfall tax on oil and gas companies, basically then to spread that around and to give people a boost in their money so that they could deal with this. But they didn't do this out of the goodness of their hearts. They're obviously great friends with the oil and gas company. So what they did to make this work for the fossil fuel companies is that they said for every new oil and gas facility that you open, we'll give you 90% tax back. And so they're getting massive tax breaks, way more than renewable energy or any kind of green technology, to open new fossil fuel industry in the UK. So, like this, none of this stuff has to happen. Like, this isn't a fact of life, and shifting those incentives around. And so if to produce, products that we need and buildings in a truly sustainable way is actually too expensive, well, guess what? The government can subsidize that, and they should be doing that to accelerate it and to make it work for society. So, I mean, there's bigger things at play here. We tend to think of the market as being this like pure thing, and it tells us what's the right thing to do. The best product will be the one that gets sold the most, and that kind of thing. I mean, that's all just nonsense, to be honest. And we need to, go back to donut economics. We need to get back to the idea that the economy has to serve us, not us serving the economy, and making it work for people and the planet, the environment. Even though I know it's interesting, because I think in some circles the idea of giving people less choice is like, that's like the American dream, is the idea that you can go and if you work hard, you can do whatever you want and buy whatever you want. So that's like, I think that's going to be something that will be difficult for society to kind of accept in the coming years.
I think, though, we will not go back to having, for example, one choice again of cereals, because I mentioned cereals earlier. It will be probably fewer choices than we have now, but still, it will not be...
It's not porridge for everyone forever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How lovely. But because you mentioned oil and gas, my next point was stop the oil. Quite catchy, isn't it? So obviously when we think about oil and gas, we mostly think about the petrol that goes in our cars, the petrol that goes in the plane, the gas that we use to heat up our homes or cook. So I think most people probably think that is all that gas and oil does for us. But actually we often forget that oil and gas industries are quite instrumental into our daily life, because we have a lot of plastic component in everyday life that we use. It could be our technology. Again, it could be the packaging of the food that we eat. It could be the fashion that we wear. It could be beauty products.
Electronics. We're sitting at a table here. We've got 2 microphones. We've got cables. We've got a laptop. So much of that is plastic, and I don't know how you could have these products without it.
Yes. And there are some industry that can't deal without plastic. Again, let's think about the healthcare industry. So all the cleanliness and sterilization that comes in hospital or in a dentist practice. So plastic is not the evil. Plastic often, it is a great material. It serves a great purpose. It doesn't break, or at least not so much. It's quite, again, sterile. It's plastic, so you can make it the shape that you wanted, the color that you wanted. So it's a great material. It was a great invention. We just have to be a bit more careful about how we use it and how much of it we need, how much of it we produce every year, every month, whatever. So here the challenge in the next 7.5 years will be to really understand what is that we can do without plastic. What is it we can go back to ceramic for, thinking about plant pots? Or how are we storing our food? Does it have to always be in plastic? This is something that, again, the food industry will have to rethink quite quickly. Like they're, for example, not using single-use plastic bags anymore in supermarkets. It was quite popular a few years ago. I think we saw the change from that. Also, some supermarkets here in the UK are banning single-use plastic when they were wrapping fruit, which was quite sad to see. But how much further can we push that?
Yeah.
How much less plastic do we need? So that is, I think, a great challenge that I'd love to see tackled in the next couple of years.
I watched a documentary recently, and someone, it was a professor on, an expert in this kind of thing. I can't remember who her name is at the moment, but she was saying that, if there is an industrial society 100 years from now, what it means is that we have stopped using fossil fuel for energy, but that we're still harvesting a little bit of oil for things like plastic that we need it for, that we literally can't find any other replacement for it. So that's an interesting idea, but it is a finite resource though. So at some point it will end. It strikes me that probably there's enough plastic already produced that if it was actually able to be recycled and turned back into other products, we probably wouldn't ever need to, I haven't done the numbers on this. I haven't actually looked at any research. I'm just thinking off the top of my head that, if our oceans are clogged with tons and tons and tons of plastic, probably some of that can be remanufactured to make new products.
I'm sure Greenpeace has run the numbers. But yes, I think this is obviously a great thought and brings me to my next and last point for this conversation, which is circularity. So circularity is a topic that's been around for a while. Again, it's not new. But how can we make sure that we produce less waste and extract fewer raw materials to have the same amount of products that we have today? As you say, Ross, materials on this planet are finite because there is only one planet. And as of this week in the UK, we pass Earth Overshoot Day. So we have to deal with it. We have to deal with the amount of materials that we have already carved out the earth and make sure that we use them at their best. Make sure that we reuse them first so that they don't go back into the waste loop. That we find the best way for materials to be recycled so that we can recycle them infinite times in the loop.
Yeah.
So sometimes what happens at the moment is maybe we recycle a plastic bottle once, but the new product can't be recycled anymore.
Okay.
So it's about that. How can we be smarter about the type of plastic that we produce going forward, or the way that we recycled it, or the way that we manage our work streams? I'm not even sure that recycling plastic, it's dealt with very efficiently anymore. But again, going back to the circularity point, we have examples where it is successful in the last few years. So, for example, the fashion industry, now the run for pre-loved fashion items, it's as big as it has ever been before.
Yeah.
So everybody knows where their thrift shop or secondhand or app is to get new old clothes.
And apps like Vinted and
exactly.
Gumtree and everything.
But so we see that it works for some items, fashion being one of these, or maybe bulky items such as buy my barbecue, buy my wardrobe, items along those lines.
Yeah.
But the big question is, how do we deal with it in the built environment, so in the construction industry? We see that it's not as much used or as widely used as yet. And there are a lot of challenges with it. And again, in this UK Green Building Council course that I completed recently, me and a group of amazing specialists within the industry came out with an innovative idea which is called Circular Score, that tried to, again, trigger behavior in the built environment to really think quite deeply about the amount of materials that are within our buildings already. And I know that you interviewed Rachel Houlihan and you talked about building as material banks and material passports. That is an idea that we have to start using tomorrow.
Yeah.
We can't wait anymore. Our buildings are already in existence. Sometimes we demolish them for any reason. It might be that they're not fit for purpose, they're not structurally sound anymore. Maybe by demolishing we can create higher density spaces, which mean less urban sprawl, which means less transport. So there are some benefits sometimes in when we talk about demolition, but if we are demolishing, we have to be doing it with proper codes. So we have to be thinking about it and make sure that none of the items that come out of that demolition are wasted if we can reuse them somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. You want to talk a little bit about what is Circular Score? and how that sort of idea could be really transformational.
Sure. So again, it's not only my idea. It was a collaborative project. So I'll share the link with you for your listeners to acknowledge on my group as well. But it's something that we based on the UK planning system, which could be used in other planning systems around the world as well. But basically, it's an incentive by which, if you are listing all materials that are in existence in a building that you are going to refurbish or demolish, and you list them on a material reuse platform, you can then be fast-tracked on the planning decision. So the developer will know quite quickly if the new building or the refurbished building is approved, which means saving on time. So this is a little bit the carrot and the stick bit. Yeah. So you have to do something for planning, but you get some time back. And that time back, in theory, is spent for then taking apart brick by brick the items that you are carving out the building, whether you're demolishing or refurbishing. And then it will give you a score at the end of the life cycle of this project, whereby you can tell people that are buying your building or people that are renting in your building how actually sustainable it is, because X% of materials in the building have been used that were used before in another building or have been kept in situ, etc. It is still an idea, so it's not completely formed as in yet, but it is something that we were very proud as a group, and we really hope to keep developing it. Yeah,
and make it a reality. I think what is great about it is it makes circularity tangible in a way. And it does. We all know about BREEAM scores or LEED scores, where you can sort of tell if a building has a badge that says, BREEAM Gold or Platinum or whatever. In the industry, we sort of know what that means. Now there's a big discussion about actually how useful are these kind of rating systems. They tend to be a bit one-dimensional and a bit in silos, so they're not perfect. But I think with circularity, there's nothing there's nothing like that where you can say, how circular is your building? And the answer to that has to be a really long winded response, because it's still quite complex. It's like, there's no easy answer. Whereas if you can say, oh, well, we got a circular score of whatever, hopefully that could come into the industry lexicon and could start to become something that's really easy for people to understand.
Yes, something that I find very important in the job that I do on a daily basis is being able to measure all the strategies that we put in place. And that is sometimes quite hard when it comes to health and well-being. So how do you measure people's health and well-being? And it is still very hard in the industry when it comes to circularity. So the idea here is that if we make it measurable, then we can implement it better. We can then, build benchmarks and understand how we should change our construction practices, or how the players in the construction industry, for instance, contractors or trades, should upskill going forward. What is that maybe they're not doing and they should learn to do, or should learn again to do, because maybe we were doing it 50 years ago. So it is about that. And in all these 4 topics that we just discussed, so the trigger behavioral change, the choice, the stop the oil, and the circularity, I feel that there is quite a lot of food for the thought.
Absolutely.
For the next 7.5 years. So I think this is a little bit of a call for action, I would say. Yeah. If you're out there and you're listening and you are a player in the industry, any industry, try change.
There's something there you can grab hold of and start to push forward, for sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Really, really good. I agree with all of that.
I'm glad. But now I think it's my time
to be the host.
To be the host. I'll be the co-host. If you'll allow me. and ask you for the first time in 50 episodes, Ross, what needs to happen by the end of this decade, so 2030,
so
that we are successful in taking action on climate change? and what is success for you?
Yeah, what does success mean for me? Well, that's a really good point. And I think it's difficult in a sense. It's difficult in a sense thinking about an idea of success in 2030 because it's starting to feel very close. As you said, just over 7 years away. It's starting to feel like, how much really can change by then? Like, how different could the world be by then? But I think fundamentally, whether it's 2030 or 2130, I suppose my idea of success is really that the world will look quite different, but in a very positive way. And so I think for many people in the industry, they're fighting for our current way of life to stay as it is. So it's like the question for many people is, how can we keep doing exactly what we're doing, but with clean energy and zero emissions? And for me, that's the wrong question to ask. The question is, what kind of life can we live that will be net zero carbon and will regenerate the natural environment, which we know we badly need to do, but which is also for a person, for a human animal, a Homo sapien, is a fulfilling, happy, safe, and fair way of life. And for many people in the world, that our current way of life is not that. So I think to achieve that vision of allowing people to actually live, properly fulfilling and lives that are in tune with our nature, I think, first of all, that will mean different things for different people. So I don't know what the answer is. And that's the point, is that it shouldn't come from one person. It shouldn't be a global vision. It should be lots and lots of local visions of what a good life is within planetary boundaries. And so I think over the next, and I think that's a long-term, that's a long-term thing. And I think if we're talking about the next 7 years, I think what we need to start doing is, first of all, start getting excited about the prospect of a future, because it's very difficult at the moment to feel excited about our future. There's a lot of anxiety and a lot of dread. But I think if we can start to open our imaginations, then we can start to envision what a future might look like that is actually worth fighting for. But if I can move into a more practical point of view and thinking again about this sort of short term to 2030, I think what I'm much more interested now in focusing on is climate adaptation. I think there's tons of fantastic people, lots of them I've had on my podcast, who are working on mitigation. And I think for me, what's flying under the radar a bit is the adaptation part of it, is that recognition that we're in climate change now. So we're experiencing it. Many of us in the global north are just starting to experience it with extreme heat waves, with flooding in Germany, with the heat dome in Canada.
With glaciers exploding in the Alps. Exactly.
That was a story a couple of weeks ago that, is kind of unheard of just a giant chunk of ice falling off the mountain.
But Ross, before we go any further
into
the topic of climate adaptation, I think it would be great if you could, just for the benefit of everyone listening to us today, explain a little bit the difference between climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation.
Okay, let's do that, because they can be slightly confusing terminology. So climate mitigation is reducing the overall amount of climate change. You can think about it like that. And so when we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that's climate mitigation, because we're reducing the overall effect of climate change. Adaptation is how, while we're experiencing climate change, how we, as individuals, as organizations, or as countries, literally change our behavior or our products or our systems in response to climate change. And so, as I said, we need to do both. Sometimes they're thought of as being two ends of the spectrum. They're actually not. They're sort of more like two sides of the same coin. We have to be doing both. But the fact is, we're living in climate change right now. We are there's a certain amount of warming that's locked in at this point. Even if we stopped emissions tomorrow, we'd still be feeling the effects of climate change for a couple of a couple of decades, possibly up to a century, which is how long carbon stays in the atmosphere. But I think what we can talk a little bit about what adaptation might mean for certain situations. But I think something that's worth thinking about is that mitigation can often feel like we can't do anything as individuals, because we say, well, what does it matter if I drive a car or I put my heating on? There's 8 billion people in the world. We're all, using too much of it. So it can feel like my actions alone are not enough. The thing with adaptation is it's very locally specific. And so actually you can make adaptations to your life, to your organization, and in your community that have a really positive beneficial impact immediately. And I find that very, very motivating.
And what are examples of adaptation, so that, just to make it a bit more real?
Yeah, definitely.
For everyone?
Definitely. Well, I'll give you an example of recently, just last week, we had the hottest temperature ever recorded in the UK.
I remember that.
Remember that?
I was here.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people listening experienced it. It was also happening. I mean, it is still happening across a lot of Europe, actually. We reached 40 degrees Celsius for the first time in the UK. It was unbearably hot in London. It was extremely hard actually to get any relief from it. When I did go outside and walked around, I made a note of all the sort of different kinds of adaptation that I saw people doing. So one example is people like you who went into their office to take advantage of the air conditioning. I work in an old uninsulated historic building with no air conditioning, so I didn't even bother going in there. I just stayed at home, which was also very, very hot. But I went out and I walked around and I saw people obviously wearing different kinds of clothes and less clothes. I saw people seeking shade a lot, and so people lying under trees, people actually carrying umbrellas so they could bring the shade around with them, wearing hats. I actually saw someone a few people in the park with paddling pools, so like with an inflatable swimming pool. I have no idea how they filled it. I would love to know how they got it in the park with water in it, but people were lying in water in the park.
I believe they used the water from the toilet taps. that is the engineer in me.
That's what you're thinking.
Trying to find a solution to this. But on top of that, some of my colleagues that had the week off because schools were just closed for holidays brought their kids next to fountains. For instance, in Granary Square in London's King's Cross, which has this beautiful floor-level fountain where kids can go play. Kids go play on it in December as well.
Yeah, it's
but
fantastic.
I believe it was terribly crowded on the heat wave days. So I believe the way that we treat the public realm as well to support people, vulnerable people such as kids or elderly in the event of heat waves, it's something that it will be more and more important going forward.
Definitely. And water is probably one of the most effective ways of staying cool. So if you can get any sort of water on your skin, that somehow it helps your body to sort of shed the heat, or to, there's some sort of scientific reason for it. But taking cold showers, taking cold baths. Some of my colleagues said they would, when they were working at their desk, they would just put their feet in a cold bucket of water, and they said that really helped. Other people said wearing a wet t-shirt or putting a towel over themselves. So I think what I saw from this was people
being quite creative
and sort of know intuitively, or will experiment with ways of adapting and trying to keep themselves safe, but also keep their lives going in a slightly normal way.
Yeah.
But other things I saw was, so I went out and I tried to find a cafe with air conditioning so that I could work in for a bit. I did find one, but I noticed while I was out, there was many shops and cafes that were just closed for the day. And they had signs up and they said, we've closed because it's too hot for our staff. And so you're getting into the realms of it actually being unsafe for people to work in because our buildings are not, haven't been designed to deal with these temperatures. And so there's lost economic activity there for a small independent business to be closed for 2 days straight and get no income could be really difficult.
And again, on this one, when we circle back to the construction industry, obviously thinking of people working outdoor,
Yeah.
maybe pouring concrete, which is one of the hottest things that you could possibly be doing in a construction site, pouring tarmac on the street on a 40 degrees day, that is unsafe.
Yeah.
So I know that Italy is considering some health and safety laws to protect workers when the temperature goes above 37 degrees, either indoor or outdoor. So it will change the way that we work and that we live our lives. I believe a lot of our colleagues also change the way that they work throughout the day, so the work pattern. So maybe they started a bit earlier, took the afternoon off, and worked again in the evening, just because it was unbearable.
Yeah.
And we know that some countries in the Mediterranean countries or elsewhere already do this culturally. So I think, as you're saying, we'll have to adapt.
Yeah.
So that we'll have to change everything so that nothing changes. so that our lives are lived in the same way, we'll have to change the way we live them.
Yeah, yeah. And there's this idea, and I'm probably not getting the definition of this right, but there's this idea of transformational adaptation, where by adapting to climate change, we can actually change the way we live in a very positive way. And that's a concept that I'm just starting to learn about. So I won't butcher it too much by misrepresenting it. But for me, I think it's clear that there's sort of good and bad adaptation. And so what you might call maladaptation is when you adapt to climate change in a way that makes climate change worse.
Okay.
And so one example of that would be our summers are getting hotter. So now everyone is fitting their homes with air conditioning, which and fueling that with fossil fuels.
Yes.
So that is a way of, dramatically increasing energy use to deal with climate change, which will cause more climate change. You get stuck in this feedback loop, which is very, very bad. The other one is to do with transport. And we were getting messages from the Mayor of London, from the local boroughs, from the transport agencies in London saying, if you can, don't travel on the days. They said because there's going to be huge travel disruptions.
Well, the Luton airport runway melted.
There you go. Exactly. So the and also railway tracks as well can warp in the heat. So the foundations of our urban infrastructure are at their sort of breaking point during these heat waves. And so that means, unfortunately, it might push people over to using private cars much more, because they might think, well, I can't rely on the trains. I can't, there's no way I'm getting in the underground, which is already pretty stuffy on a good day, would be unbearable in 40 degrees heat. They said, I'm just going to drive. And of course, that is just adding more emissions and that kind of thing. Just to finish out with this topic on adaptation, if we move to the sort of urban scale, that I think some of the things that we can think about as built environment professionals that we should be now implementing in our schemes and in our discussions with people is really about this idea of adaptation that is transformational or very beneficial to our lives. And so, for instance, when you insulate a building, either a new building or an existing building, you retrofit it to be highly insulated, that will keep occupants warm in winter. It'll also keep us cool in summer. So that's a double, that's fantastic. Will also reduce energy bills. So that's an economic benefit for residents, also reduces emissions because you need very, very little input of energy to heat or to cool the house. That's a fantastic example. The other one is bringing more plants and biodiversity into cities. One of the most, I think, powerful ways of adapting to both wetter winters, which will bring flooding, and hotter summers of heat waves, is actually replacing a lot of our hard surfaces and man-made, not a very good term, but human-made surfaces with natural surfaces, soil and grass and trees and
green roofs
and lots of different, ponds. Actually, having bodies of water are also fantastic cooling as well. And so by doing all of that, we can really start to reduce the temperature in cities, provide more shade for people, which is what people will seek out during heat waves, but also they help to deal with surface flooding in a very, very good way. and I've talked about urban greening and this kind of stuff so many times on the podcast. I'm sure everyone listening has heard all this before, but just how positive it is for our well-being, for the air quality, for biodiversity, and all that kind of thing. So I suppose if we come back to my original point about creating a vision, if London is right now something like 48% green and blue surface, which it is, it's natural surfaces almost half. My sort of vision for a future that is sort of worth fighting for would be like 70 or 80% natural cover. It's not going to happen by 2030, but there's nothing that says it's impossible. And I think drastically rethinking both the roofs of our buildings, but also the streets that we have. There's so much space that is given over to private vehicles that I think is fundamentally a 20th century idea.
Yes.
And that we need, if we're moving into a 21st century where people can thrive alongside other living beings, we need to drastically rethink actually how streets in cities are prioritized, what the surface is there, what the surface is like, and what kind of habitats they can play host to.
Yeah, what's the best purpose for the space? Is it a car park or is it the park?
Yes, exactly. And even our parks, I think I always, celebrate living so close to Victoria Park, fantastic, large, grand public park that gives, so much benefit to everyone. But during the last couple of weeks of heat and very little rainfall, it has all these sort of vast swathes of lawn, this grass that they keep cut quite short, has just turned yellow and died. And so we need to be also rethinking the places that are already green, in inverted commas, not always green or yellow, can be much more resilient. And I think thinking about how does the sort of ecology of our cities adapt to climate change as well? Do we need to manage these spaces differently? Do we maybe need to let them grow more wild and to sort of build up their natural resiliency to these things? Is I think another big question, because we can't let our parks turn into dusty, sandy deserts that are sort of not really providing any benefit every summer. So there could be so much more,
Absolutely. This is a big call for action as well.
Yeah, I think so. And these are practical things that people, if you're an architect, if you're a planner, if you're anyway involved in the public, in the built environment, on your next project, think about what are the effects of climate change that we're feeling now and that we're going to keep feeling for the next 100 years, and how does my project need to ensure that people can stay safe and healthy and also live enjoyable lives, in that context. And so, you'll figure out what that means for you.
I totally agree. And I think with this, Ross, I would say thank you for coming on my podcast today. But most of all, thank you for asking me the climate change question for the first time. And I hope you enjoyed being asked the question as well.
I did. I'm not sure how coherent my response was, but that's a brain dump of what I'm thinking of at the moment.
It's good. I think we can all agree with what you said.
Excellent. Should we close it there?
Sounds good.
End of the Giulia Urbanist
Yes.
podcast.